Hey everyone, Sam here. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you are in the world. And it's a beautiful spring day here in northern New Zealand, and it's so nice that I decided that I would do the intro to this video out in my garden. We've got banana plants in the background, and also my studio is a complete tip at the moment. It looks like a bomb's hit it, so I thought I'd do it outside. So in this video I'm going to show you how we can create light and shadow in a landscape painting. And this painting is inspired by the mountains in a place called Glenorchy in southern New Zealand. Now you can create some really dramatic effects in a painting by having a sharp contrast between areas in shadow and areas in light. So I'm going to show you how we can create some of these effects in this painting. I'll also give you some tips on mixing greens, so those distant greens on the upper hills there and the shadow greens in the foreground. Now before we start the video, I'd just like to quickly tell you about Portfolio Box. If you're an artist or creative and you're looking to make your own website, then check out portfoliobox.net. It's an online website builder where you can create your own beautiful website to showcase your work to the highest standard. It's really easy to use, and there's loads of styles and templates for you to choose from. You can start building your website right away, and then when you want it to go live, simply choose the plan that you wish to purchase. And right now Portfolio Box are offering a 50% discount on any of their plans for the first year by typing in the discount code SAMERP50. And I've put the link and the discount code in the description box below. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this video. Get your paintbrushes ready and let's roll the tape. This painting is inspired by one of my many plein air painting trips that I've taken to a place called Glenorchy in southern New Zealand. It sits at the base of Lake Wakatipu, and it's about a 45-minute drive away from Queenstown. Now on one of my painting trips I had my camera ready, and I just really liked the way the light was illuminating the sides of the hills and the base of the mountain, and then you have the sharp contrast with the areas that are in shadow in the foreground. So we have these fields where the sheep are grazing and the foothills where there's lots of deciduous trees such as black poplars. These are all in shadow, and on the day I took these photos the light just looked so dramatic that I wanted to do a studio painting of this scene. So here I'm working on a 10" by 12" linen canvas panel, and I absolutely love painting on these. They're made by a company in the USA at canvaspanels.com, and they're perfect for plein air painting and studio work. I've toned the linen surface with a layer of burnt sienna, and this just helps to warm up the painting. So I did this previously and allowed it to dry. It's just a wash, so I mixed the burnt sienna with some pure gum turpentine and a little bit of liquid to speed up the drying time. Now I'm using oil paint, so I am going to be using liquid as my medium, and this helps to thin the paint and it speeds up the drying time. But I really like that burnt sienna layer underneath because it helps to warm up the painting and it gives the painting a more traditional feel. So I'm using a #1 round brush and burnt sienna mixed with a bit of liquid, and I sketch out my composition. The main thing I wanted to capture in this painting is the light and that contrast between the area of the hill and the base of the mountain that's in the full sunlight, juxtaposed against the fields, foothills and trees that are in shadow. I've added a couple of things in this painting to help lead the eye towards the summit of the mountain. Mostly the trees, but also a few subtle lines where there's waterways within the side of the hills. As I sketch out my composition, I'll just go over the colours that I used for this painting, which include titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow oxide, cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, quinacridone crimson, ultramarine blue, cobalt teal and phthalo green. Right, let's start getting some paint on this thing. Whenever I start a painting, I always think about where are all my dark values and shadows, because I always paint these first. Now, value refers to how light or dark a subject is, and we're likely to find our darkest darks in the foreground as well as our lightest lights, Whereas as landforms recede into the distance, darks aren't as dark and lights are not quite as light as the value scale narrows. So I find it easiest to establish my dark values first. It just makes it much easier to then apply the areas that are in light afterwards, and it also makes it easier to get the saturation of the colour right as well. So I start by painting my cloud shadows, and this is a mix of burnt sienna with some ultramarine blue. Then I mix in titanium white until I get the value that I want. And then I also mix in a little bit of quinacridone crimson to give the mix a violet tint. I apply the paint with a number 5 flat brush, and as I'm in the blocking in stage I'm going to be using larger brushes to begin with so I can get some loose painterly gestural brush marks. This will give a looseness to the painting and I can then add detail later on. Once I've marked in the clouds, the next darkest areas is the summit of the mountain and some of those tree shadows that are in the midground. Now I'm using the same colours that I used for the clouds here, which was a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna and titanium white, but I'm using less titanium white this time, and this is going to make the value darker. So we're coming forward in the painting and those shadows are going to be getting darker as a result. I also mix in a little bit of quinacridone crimson to give it a violet tint. But it's not essential to use this colour. Now trees are some of the darkest values you're likely to find in the landscape, so you need to keep this in mind. Our darkest values are going to be found in the foreground, and as the foreground is in shadow, the trees are going to be dark. What I've done here is I've mixed ultramarine blue with a little bit of yellow oxide just to give it a slight green cast. Now in this painting it's that contrast between the area in the foreground that's completely in shadow and the background that's in full sunlight that's going to create the drama and atmosphere within the painting. I'm still using a number 5 flat brush here and I'm marking in the poplars and other deciduous trees and the bushes on the foothills there. So now the darks are marked in, we've got an instant tonal dynamic here. So we've got the sky and clouds, then we've got the mountains and the tree shadows in the midground, and then those dark shadows in the foreground. So now I'm going to start adding some highlights to the clouds, and I'm also going to mix in some of those highlights with the cloud shadows. For this I'm using titanium white with a little bit of burnt sienna, and as burnt sienna is actually a dark orange, it's going to give the titanium white a nice orange glow to it. It's also going to mix in nicely with the cloud shadows because we've already used these colours. So I mark in the highlights and then I blend in some of these colours with the cloud shadows to create some of those halftones that are within the clouds. I'm keeping the sky mix simple and it's just ultramarine blue with some titanium white, and I can use the sky mix to fill in the negative spaces around the cloud edges, which will also help to give the clouds definition. Now I'm going to be working on the upper section of the mountain here, which has a lot of tussock grass growing on there. There's a few more shadows here which I'm going to mark in now, but as the tussock grass is a golden olive colour, I need to reflect that in the shadows as well. So what I've done here is mixed ultramarine blue, some titanium white, a little bit of quinacridone crimson and some yellow oxide. When it comes to painting the tussock grass that's in the full sunlight, I need to keep my colour relatively desaturated and also light in value. Now I start off with yellow oxide mixed with some titanium white, but this on its own is still saturated, so how do we desaturate a yellow? Well, this is where we need to think about the colour wheel. And what is opposite to yellow on the colour wheel? Well, it's violet. So what I've done here is I've mixed in some ultramarine blue, which is also going to make the value of the mixture a little darker. However, mixing ultramarine blue with yellow oxide is going to create a green. So this is where I need to add some quinacridone crimson, as blue and quinacridone crimson together is going to make a violet. And so violet is opposite to yellow on the colour wheel. This is going to desaturate the colour and we can create some pale, low chroma yellows which are really suitable for painting mountain grass and straw coloured grass that you'd see in distant mountains. Next, I start painting the foliage on the trees in the upper section of the mountain, and these are mostly native New Zealand trees which are quite dark in value. I need to mix a low chroma green, but I want to make it still look natural and vibrant. Now, chroma is another word for saturation, and the colours I've used here are ultramarine blue with yellow oxide, titanium white and a little bit of burnt sienna. And as burnt sienna contains red, which is the colour opposite to green on the colour wheel, that's just going to make that colour look really natural. Once I've painted those trees, I next want to paint the grass in the upper section of this mountain. And this is quite pale, but a nice grass green with some emerald undertones. Now, I don't want my green to be too saturated, so I'm going to stick with using yellow oxide as it's a lower chroma yellow. And I mix this with some cobalt teal, and cobalt teal is kind of like a light turquoise blue, so we're going to create some nice emerald colours with that. I also mix in some titanium white, which is going to make the value lighter, and then I round off that mixture with some quinacridone crimson, as the red in this crimson is going to harmonise the green. As I work my way down the mountain towards the foothills, the fields are starting to get closer to the viewer, so I can increase the saturation a little bit. This is because we're much more likely to find our most saturated colours in the foreground of a landscape. So what I've done here is I've mixed some yellow oxide with ultramarine blue, and then I've increased the saturation of the colour by mixing in some cadmium yellow. I can then make the value lighter by mixing in some titanium white. And here I'm using a number 3 bristle filbert brush to paint those fields. I really like using filbert brushes for painting landscapes because you can create some broad gestural brush marks with them, but then you can also use the rounded edge of the brush for creating finer details. So at this point the background's largely established, and now we're just going to paint those foothills in the foreground. These are in shadow, so I'm going to need to create a darker mix. Now, the one thing to keep in mind when you're painting grass is one of the lighter values you'll find in the landscape, and much lighter than trees. So we need to keep this in mind so that the trees stand out in the landscape. I want to mix a cool darker green here, so I start with yellow oxide, ultramarine blue, and then I mix in some cobalt teal and titanium white. I also mix in a little bit of quinacridone crimson as well. I mark in the foothills and the field in the foreground with a number 5 flat brush. I make the grass in the field in the foreground a little bit lighter in value than the foothills, and then I mix in a little bit more titanium white into the mix in order to paint some reflected light in some of those hills, which is going to help create a more 3-dimensional form. At this point in the painting, I've roughly established all my basic colours and values here, so it's now a question of finishing up the blocking in stage by tidying the whole thing up and restating some of those dark values. Now, I'm not worried about detail during the blocking in stage, but I do want to tidy up some of these areas just to make it easier for myself when I come to start adding detail to the painting once I've let it dry. Overall, I've kept this painting a little bit more loose and gestural and not so much detail, as I felt that it didn't really need it that much. This painting is really all about the light and the atmosphere. Now, I reworked some of those cloud shadows, and then I move on to the upper section of the mountain where I do a bit of a value adjustment to the tussock grass, which I've now made a little bit lighter. I start restating and adding a few more shadows to the trees in the upper section of the mountain, which is going to add more definition to the trees overall, as well as give a sense of evening light. I also made a little value adjustment to the grass in the background and just made it a little bit lighter. I was still using the same colours, but just with a little bit more titanium white mixed in. There's a few crimson brown coloured plants growing on the hills, so I'm going to add these into my painting as this is going to help bring some balance towards the green field. So what I've done here is I've taken my existing green mix and just mixed in a little bit of quinacridone crimson. Now of course the red in there is opposite to green, so it's going to complement those fields really nicely. I mark in some more trees and then I restate those trees that are on the foothills towards the foreground. And again, I'm using the same colours that I was using a moment ago, which was a mix of ultramarine blue with some yellow oxide. I'd left a couple of gaps to the hills in the midground, and this is where I was going to paint in some Lombardy poplar trees which were growing there. And at the time when I visited this location it was autumn, so these trees had turned yellow. I mix the yellow here with yellow oxide, a small amount of cadmium yellow, a little bit of quinacridone crimson and some titanium white. Lastly, I'm marking the suggestion of a few sheep, and what I've done here is I've taken my cloud mixture and just added in some more titanium white, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and a little quinacridone crimson. At this point of the painting I allow it to dry so that I can then start adding a few details to it. Now whenever I block in a painting I always try and do it in one sitting, and then when I've completed it I always ask myself, is this painting working and are the colours and values all working in harmony with each other? I also generally keep my paintings a little bit darker in value so that I've still got plenty of room to add lighter layers as I work through the painting. I'll then be saving my lightest values until the very end. But really you can already see how this painting is going to come together. So all I was doing from now on was adding more lighter layers on top of the previous ones and just adding in a few more details. So I come back to the sky and clouds here and just work in some more highlights in the clouds and define the shapes of the clouds by filling in the negative spaces around them with the sky mix. I also spent some time adding more cloud shadows and working the shape of the clouds. Then once I'd finished the clouds I started working on the upper section of the mountain, where I made another value adjustment and started adding some lighter layers. However, I still allowed some of those initial layers of paint to come through. Following this I then spent some time working on those trees in the upper part of the mountain, and I'm using a number 3 Filbert brush here. I've added a few more trees and I'm using the same colours that I was using during the blocking in phase, which was a mix of ultramarine blue with yellow oxide, some burnt sienna and titanium white. I then painted the Monterey cypress trees that are in the midground, and I've increased the saturation of the colour slightly, so I'm using ultramarine blue with yellow oxide, and I then introduced some cadmium yellow into the mix just to increase the saturation a little bit. I add a few lighter layers to the grass that's in the background, and just like before I'm using the same colours, which was a mix of yellow oxide with cobalt teal, titanium white and quinacridone crimson, but I've used more titanium white in the mix. This pale colour is going to help make those distant fields sit back in the landscape. I add some more paint layers to those lower fields in the midground there, and I also increase the saturation of the green slightly. So what I've done here is I've mixed cadmium yellow with some ultramarine blue, and then I've increased the saturation by mixing in a little bit of phthalo green. I then round off the colour with some quinacridone crimson, and I also mix in a little bit of titanium white. Next I work on the trees in the foothills there towards the foreground, and I want to paint some reflected light in these trees, and this is going to help create a little bit of definition. Now these trees are so dark in value that there's really not that much difference between the core shadows and the reflected light in the foliage. I've used the same colours that I used in the blocking in stage, a mix of ultramarine blue with yellow oxide, but I've used more yellow oxide in the mix as this will make the value a little bit lighter. I've also rounded off the colour with some burnt sienna as well. I paint some more reflected light in the grass using the same colours that I used during the blocking in stage, but with more titanium white in the mix, and then I start marking in some grass shadows in the foreground. At this point in the painting I could see the end in sight, and there wasn't really that much left to do to get it finished. I added more detail and colour to the trees in the midground, particularly some of those Monterey cypress trees. Now with some of those trees on the foothills, I just wanted to create the illusion that some of the upper sections of their tree canopies were in the full sunlight. So I painted these areas and added a few more lighter layers to the Monterey cypress trees in the midground. I tidied up the upper section of the mountain and just added a few refinements to the clouds. As well as this, I added a few extra highlights to the straw-coloured tussock grass in the upper section of the mountain, again using the same colours that I used before but just with more titanium white in the mix. I spent some time working on the sheep in the foreground, and this required some finer brushwork, so I used a No. 0 synthetic round brush to paint a little bit of detail within some of the sheep. Now, as I've wanted to keep this painting loose and gestural, I haven't gone too mad with the detail in the sheep in the foreground. More just a suggestion of the shapes. I want to keep the sheep fluid with the rest of the painting, so that they don't look too rigid. The colours that I used to paint the sheep are the same colours that I used in the mountain and cloud shadows, so a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and a little bit of quinacridone crimson. I finish up the painting by just adding a few extra details here and there, the odd few details to the Monterey cypress trees in the midground, and I add a few extra details to the trees and shrubs that are in the foothills towards the foreground. I added a little bit more yellow oxide and burnt sienna into my mix just to create some interest there. It was here that I decided that the painting was complete. I really enjoy painting these more loose gestural landscape paintings as they have an aliveness to them. Now if you'd like to have a go at painting this yourself, then check out the lesson notes that accompany this video, which I've published on my website blog, and I've put the link in the description below. Feel free to use the reference photos and copy the painting. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Also, feel free to leave me a comment in the comments section below. Now if you'd like to learn more about painting, then check out the painting resources I have available on my website at samuelearp.com. I have loads of free written painting tutorials that you can copy and use the reference photos, and I also have full-length painting tutorial videos available for sale from my website. Now you can get instant access to all of those painting tutorial videos as well by subscribing to me on Patreon for just $5 a month. As I say, you get instant access to all of my full-length painting tutorial videos and a new video every month, and I've put all the links in the description below. If you'd like to see what artworks I'm working on at the moment, then you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and my other website at samuelearpfineart.com, which is just for my paintings. Don't forget, you can get a 50% discount on any of the plans available at portfoliobox.net if you would like to make your own website, simply by typing in the discount code SAMEARP50. And again, I've put the link and discount code in the description box below. So thanks for watching, have a beautiful day, and I shall see you in the next video.